Mega machines cutting through solid rock. The transportation of multi-ton stone blocks. Modern aircraft carrying millions of people each day around the world, and space shuttles sending humans to the stars. But are these examples of modern technology? Or is there evidence that these incredible achievements existed on Earth thousands of years ago? And you begin to ask yourself, are we missing part of the story? Could ancient man have possessed knowledge far beyond that of our own century? And if so, where did it come from? I think that people in ancient times were visited by beings coming not from this earth, and they gave us scientific technologies. It becomes ever more apparent that the possible answer to have aliens visited in the past could be a potential yes. Millions of people around the world believe we have been visited in the past by extraterrestrial beings. What if it were true? Did ancient aliens really help to shape our history? And if so, what if there were clues left behind, sometimes hiding in plain sight? What if we could find the evidence? Saqqara, Egypt. Located roughly 20 miles south of Cairo, is home to the world-famous Step Pyramid of King Djoser, dating back more than 4,000 years. It is the oldest of Egypt's 97 pyramids. Saqqara is also famous for being one of Egypt's oldest burial grounds, earning it the nickname City of the Dead. It was here in 1891 that a French archaeologist unearthed an ancient tomb containing the burial remains of Padi Amen, an official from the 3rd century BC. Among the various items discovered was a small wooden model of what appeared to be a bird, lying beside a papyrus bearing the inscription, "I want to fly." The artifact was later sent to the Cairo Museum, where authorities placed it alongside several other bird figurines. The model sat largely unnoticed until 1969, when Egyptologist Dr. Khalil Messiha was examining the bird collection and noticed that there was something very different about the Saqqara bird. It's interesting because, on one hand, clearly it should look like a bird because it has eyes and has the typical nose of a bird. On the other hand, the wings are clearly not bird wings. In the middle of the room, you see this wing a bit thicker in this region. The lift is highest here. The whole thing becomes thinner to the end of the wings, and those wings are molded down. This is a very modern aerodynamic design. Then the other point is birds have no rudders, because a bird does not need a rudder due to its aerodynamic architecture. And so, there is the idea they are not representing birds, but flying machines or aircraft. Could the ancient Egyptians have possessed the power of flight? In 2006, aviation and aerodynamics expert Simon Sanderson built a scale model of the Saqqara bird, 5 times larger than the original, to test that possibility. We're running at constant speed, slowly increasing the angle of attack, and then measuring the forces it's producing. That way, we can learn about its flight characteristics. At 10 degrees, we're producing 4 times the weight and lift. Yeah, so it actually would be flying there. Yeah, that's good. Tests showed the Saqqara bird is a highly developed glider, and this is the design we use today. During the Sanderson test, it was discovered that the only thing preventing the Saqqara bird from achieving flight was the lack of a rear stabilizing rudder or elevator needed to maintain balance. Is it possible that the Saqqara bird ever possessed this critical component? What is missing is something like an elevator. But if you look at this feature here, we may interpret that something like an elevator was connected here or was lost during history. Computer models seem to confirm that the Saqqara bird is certainly airworthy, but there is another problem to consider: launching a glider. Modern methods require the use of a tow plane that pulls the glider into the air, then releases it when a proper altitude is reached. So how might the ancient Egyptians have launched the Saqqara bird? The scientists of Egyptology told us that such a bird could be powered off by catapults to fly, and we had high acceptance by Egyptian scientists. The idea of using a catapult does have a contemporary parallel. Many of today's glider enthusiasts employ a bungee cord system to launch their sailcraft into the air. But if the Saqqara bird is capable of flight, where would ancient Egyptians have acquired such technology? I think that the people in ancient times were visited by beings coming not from this earth, and they gave us culture and scientific technologies to improve our life on Earth, moving from the primitive to a higher developed culture. If ancient cultures were able to produce any really flyable machine, they would be far more advanced than we believe today. It changes our viewpoint of ancient societies. It's the fact that our ancestors were more intelligent and had more technological capabilities than our history books give them credit for. You begin to ask yourself, are we missing part of the story? And honestly, I think we are. I think there has been a forgotten episode in human history, and we're a species with amnesia. We don't really remember who or what we are. I haven't been convinced that there is evidence that supports an ancient visitation, but there is no reason why not. And I think to shut oneself to that possibility is a mistake, mainly because there are so many anomalies that we can't explain. 7,000 miles from Egypt, the dense jungles and rugged mountains of Colombia contain a vast number of archaeological sites. Many treasure hunters believe the legendary City of Gold, El Dorado, lies hidden here somewhere under a thick canopy of trees. While the mythical metropolis has never been found, early in the 20th century, two robbers searching along the Magdalena River stumbled upon a grave site dating back 1,500 years to a pre-Columbian civilization known as the Tolima. Among the funerary objects found, there were hundreds of small 2 to 3 inch gold figurines. Many of those looked like insects and fish. However, out of those hundreds that they found, they also found about a dozen that are eerily reminiscent of modern-day fighter jets. They have a triangular shape, they have an upright tail fin, stabilizers, and a fuselage, and they have nothing in common with anything similar in nature. Could these gold objects really be proof that Earth has been visited by ancient aliens? One of the objects shows typical swept wings, like with a modern aircraft. And if you compare it to something like a space shuttle, you see that the basic wing shape is very similar to wing shapes for high-speed aerodynamic bodies, like a space shuttle is. There is not a single insect in the world which has its wings at the bottom. And when you exclude the possibility that it's an insect, one of the things which remain is the fact that this is actually, yes, what it looks like, a plane. In 1997, German aviation experts, including Algund Inboom and Peter Belting, set out to prove the speculation by building a scale model replica of the Gold Flyer, fully equipped with landing gear and a working engine. It was rather simple because we didn't need to put many parts to this shape because this shape is perfect. Everything was already done by the native people 2,000 years ago. They did not add an inch or remove an inch. They just essentially blew the little thing into a larger size. I mean, this is sensational that pre-Columbian culture knew about aerodynamics. Once completed, the remote-controlled flyer took off down a makeshift runway and flew. When you see this thing taking off, you really feel that this is the real deal. It was a very successful test and showed us how perfect ancient people were at working out aerodynamic design. It shows you that something must have happened. We are not quite sure how it did, but that it did. This is applied science. This isn't just thinking somewhere. This is people going out there and making sure and proving with eyes to see. Anybody can see this, that this is real. This is genuine. This little thing which sits in the museum could fly. So we have two examples from opposite sides of the planet, and both examples are aerodynamically sound, and they fly. So to suggest that all of this is coincidence, after a while, even coincidence no longer makes sense. Could the ancients have seen actual entities, like ancient gods, ancient astronauts, actually flying around in what amounted to modern aircraft? The answer to these questions may be found in ancient documents that describe flight patterns, aircraft specs, and even aerial battles in remarkable detail. Over the past 50 years, NASA has sent astronauts into space inside large rockets. This method has been described by some as simply putting a man on a large firecracker and lighting the fuse. Man's ability to travel farther into space will require more advanced propulsion systems. Several are being researched by NASA. There are a wide variety of advanced propulsion technologies that are being actively developed and studied by NASA and other researchers. A really exotic version of that is to use a launch assist catapult. Use technology derived from the magnetic levitation trains to build a maglev sled that carries your rocket, gets it up to about Mach 1, and then launches the rocket from it. While these futuristic propulsion systems seem like something out of science fiction, ancient alien theorists believe past civilizations possess these same advanced technologies. They point to a number of cultural myths that describe sky people coming to Earth in fire-breathing dragons or metallic-looking machines as proof of extraterrestrial visitation. In my mind, legends and myths are based on something real, and while they've been mythified and exaggerated in many cases, in my mind there's some core of truth here, in that people really were flying in airships in ancient times, just like we do today. But might these airships have reached Earth using the same type of propulsion systems we use today? The answer may be found deep in the Indian subcontinent. India. Over 1.1 billion people crowd its modern cities and rural townships, speaking hundreds of languages and practicing a number of different religions. India is considered one of the oldest civilizations, with settlements dating back over 11,000 years. It is also home to several of the oldest records of ancient technologies. Ancient Sanskrit texts dating back as far as 6000 BC describe in varying but vivid detail flying machines called vimanas. Vimanas are airplanes, and they are powered by some jet engines. This seems to be true because of all the descriptions of the flight behavior. Elephants ran away in panic. Grass was thrown out because there was a lot of pressure from behind those vimanas. So we can say this is the description of a spaceship. Although mainstream historians believe the Vimana texts are myths, many of the documents contain passages that seem to describe modern machinery and technology. The Vimanika Shastra goes into metals that are used in each craft. It talks about electricity and power sources. It talks about the pilots and the clothing they have to wear. It talks about the food that they eat. It talks even about the weapons that are kept on these airships. The flight manuals of the Vimanas are quite similar to the flight manuals you find in the modern passenger flight business, or when you go to the military jet engines, of course. They have also flight manuals because it's necessary for a pilot to get knowledge about his plane he wants to fly with. We also learn that these Vimanas could be controlled mentally, and this is a technology that modern militaries are beginning to develop even today. With these advances, we think we are making almost every manifestation of an actual extraterrestrial civilization today would look almost like magic to us, where it has to do with technological electromagnetic systems that interface with coherent thought and organized thought. And this gets into, people go, wow, now you're losing me here. But I tell people, I said, yeah, well, you've got to push your boundaries a little bit if you're talking about a true interstellar civilization. The Vimanika Shastra, or science of aeronautics, indicates Vimanas used a propulsion system based on a combination of gyroscopes, electricity, and mercury. Is this possible? Mercury is an unusual element. Mercury is a metal, it's also a liquid, and is a conductor of electricity. Now there's unusual things you can do with mercury. You can put it into a closed gyroscopic device with mercury spinning around, and then you can electrify it. And studies have been done on this by NASA and by other scientists, and they find that you have levitation effects, anti-gravity kind of effects, and a spinning bright light is part of it too. The Vimanika Shastra suggests Vimanas were powered by several gyroscopes placed inside a sealed liquid mercury vortex. Here's an example of a little kid's gyroscope. You spin it with a heavy wheel around a central axis. Well, gyroscopes seem to do a lot of strange things, even defy gravity. And it does this because it uses what's called rotational or angular momentum, and it wants to keep a particular orientation on its spin axis, the center rod. If you push on that rod, it will want to righten itself up to its original orientation. It wants to keep that same angular momentum. Gyroscopes are used all over the place, in airplanes and spacecraft and submarines. This allows them to determine their position based on where they started. They can also use it for finding their velocity, or even just the orientation of the vehicle in space. One of the texts talks about Mercury rotating and driving some sort of a powerful wind or a windmill effect. That might be some sort of what we call a flywheel energy storage, where you have a spinning disk and then you extract energy from it slowly. That would be the Mercury, and then that could be used to drive some sort of propeller, or what is called a fan sort of system, like you have on a hovercraft. Mercury would be quite good for that because it's a high density, so you have a small package for your power plant. That's always good when you're building an aircraft. Flywheel energy storage systems, however, tend to lose power quickly. To navigate across space, its size would have to be enormous. They're fine for use by power companies for load leveling. You put energy in when you don't need it, you get energy out when you need it, but they're sitting on the ground. To have something wide enough to actually fly, it's not at all clear that this would be a practical device. Now maybe the people were trying to describe something that kind of looked like this to them. It might not have actually been mercury. It might have been some other liquid metal. The mercury vortex engine is perhaps a failure in the translation, because the vortex is not a material quite suitable to a jet engine. The issue of how are these civilizations traveling faster than the speed of light is a fundamental question. It's a scientific application of things that have been studied for thousands of years, and there are within the Vedas, the ancient Vedic teachings or other ancient teachings, and it is there. But if the Vimanas existed, could this prove there was a worldwide transportation network thousands of years before Columbus? The answer might be found on a mountaintop outside Mexico City. In the 21st century, modern transportation and communication methods have connected the world like never before. Products or ideas, no matter where in the world they may have originated, can spread to even the most remote countries. A hip-hop hit in Brooklyn might make it big in Tokyo before it's even heard in Manhattan. This cultural interconnection has transformed the globe. But is it new? Mainstream archaeologists believe ancient civilizations, such as those found in the remote Pacific Islands, Asia, and South America, developed independently from each other. But ancient astronaut theorists contend that similarities in building styles and beliefs found in these cultures suggest that a worldwide trade route may have connected them to each other. But just like we have airports today around the world, in ancient times with the Vimanas, there would have been hangars for the craft, airports for them to land, and those airports would have been situated in strategic places around the world. And that's exactly what we see in remote places. Could the complex set of lines covering Peru's Nazca Plain, or the mysterious plateau above Mexico's Oaxaca Valley, be evidence of runways for a worldwide air transportation system? One of the unusual archaeological sites in Mexico is a place called Monte Alban. That is also a mountain where the top of the mountain was completely cut off and leveled to make a very flat tabletop mountain. And there's a megalithic city there too that's extremely old. This was probably some kind of Vimana airport. The Vimanas could be a kind of missing link between the single cultures in the world, because they had just a very short time to fly from one part of the world to the other. Legends of air travel are also found in ancient Africa and the Middle East. According to the Kebra Nagast, a holy book of the Ethiopians written sometime before the 2nd century AD, the Queen of Sheba was once given a gift of a flying carpet by King Solomon of Israel. The Kebra Nagast is one of the most important texts you've never heard of. The Kebra Nagast means the Book of Kings, and it is the most sacred book of the Ethiopians. In it, King Solomon is described as having access to some type of flying machine, and in that part of the world, the term flying carpet was always used very liberally. My question is, did they really mean actual flying carpets, or was it another term with which to describe some type of flying machine? This was the original chariots of the gods that Eric von Daniken talked about, the flying magic carpets of the Arabian Nights stories. There are traditions in the Middle East of King Solomon having this airship and flying to different places in the Middle East, certain mountains which are known as the Mountains of Solomon. These may have been certain airports or landing areas for these Vimanas. Nicholas Roerich, a famous Russian-American explorer who traveled all through Central Asia and Tibet in the 1920s, he too claimed that Tibetans had traditions of King Solomon flying to Tibet in this aircraft. The Kebra Nagast also describes how King Solomon used his flying airship to make maps of the world. But could these have any relation to other ancient maps some believe may have been made by extraterrestrials? Some of these maps show the world not as it looks today, but as it looked during the last ice age, and this is really hard to explain. Everybody's heard of the Piri Reis map, and they perhaps have not heard of the Orontius Phineas map, or the Mercator maps that show Antarctica in great detail hundreds of years before Antarctica was even discovered. One of the most referenced stories of ancient aircraft is found in a surprising place, the Bible. In the book of Ezekiel, the prophet describes a flying chariot containing wheels within wheels and powered by angels. Although Bible historians suggest Ezekiel was speaking symbolically about the terrifying enemies facing Israel, could this be another example of an alien visitation and proof that prehistoric aircraft existed? In the story of Ezekiel's throne chariot, this flying vehicle that doesn't seem to have any means of propulsion, if we thought of the word angel as representing something like celestial energy, it sounds much more like a spacecraft then, because some of the angels are going back and forth. Well, that sounds like flames. That sounds like propulsion. So are there wheels? Well, those sound like flying saucers. Our ancestors weren't idiots. Ezekiel saw something that was so frightening to him that he fell to his knees. Then, Out of the glory of God came this being in these bright clothes that looked like metal, and told Ezekiel, "All right, man, we brought you here. We want you to measure this monument, this building." And Ezekiel asks, "Well, why should I do this?" And the being says, "That's why we brought you here." And then you have 40 pages in the second part of the book of Ezekiel, with measurement after measurement after measurement of this gigantic building, in which, by the way, the glory of the Lord landed. In the early 1970s, NASA scientist Joseph Blumrich set out to disprove the theory that what Ezekiel witnessed was a spaceship. Joseph Blumrich is your proverbial rocket scientist. He worked on the Moon project for NASA, and from the mind of a rocket engineer started to look at what was written in the first part of the book of Ezekiel. And after many months of research, Joseph Blumrich came to the conclusion that what Ezekiel described in his eyewitness report, it was indeed a type of spacecraft. Joseph Blumrich would go on to write The Spaceships of Ezekiel. Several years later, a German structural engineer named Hans Herbert Bayer sketched out a blueprint of the second section of the book of Ezekiel, where Ezekiel is told to construct an open-top building to house the flying chariot. Ezekiel's spaceship fit exactly into the temple that Hans Herbert Bayer recreated. So what we have here is a proof by indication. Here we have a NASA engineer and a structural engineer. They didn't know of each other's work, and both pieces fit together like a puzzle. In any court of law, that's evidence that would hold up. I think that scientists feel uncomfortable with the notion of a lost civilization precisely because the evidence for it is so ambiguous. It's not so in your face that it's immediately obvious, and the result is that science has not welcomed this idea. It'll take much more evidence before it's widely accepted. The God that I believe in doesn't need a vehicle in which to move around from point A to point B. Whatever was described in the Old Testament wasn't God. It was a misunderstood flesh and blood extraterrestrial, whom our ancestors misinterpreted as being divine and supernatural. And why? Because of misunderstood technology. And that is the underlying thread that applies to all of the ancient astronaut theory. But while ancient texts provide tantalizing clues to our past, physical evidence paints an even clearer picture. But will modern science finally prove the ancient astronaut theory? Did the ancient civilizations of Earth have access to advanced technology? Well, it seems like they had something going on. The passage continues as in the previous parts, correcting grammar and maintaining clarity.